All right, good morning. It's a pleasure to be here, Professor Parker's class. I know that this is an intro course in information technology. So I'll start off by introducing myself real briefly. And those of you who may want to ask questions later on, either about my presentation or background. But I currently am basically an inventor, entrepreneur. I'm involved in a couple of companies. One is here in the United States, and it's a group of people that I worked through the years, and we work on consulting with several different companies. Another one is a company that I'm the chief science officer. That's the one I'm going to talk about, which is based in Mexico City. Again, my name is Tony Garcia. I spent time as an engineer working in industry, Exxon Research Engineering, back in when I first graduated in chemical engineering. Then when I got my Ph.D., I worked at Eastman Kodak Bioscience Research Laboratories. Eastman Kodak is no longer around. Most of the patents were bought out by Motorola quite a few years ago now. But then I spent 34 years as a professor and administrator at ASU at Mexico State University. So that, by way of introduction, it's relevant because I'm not really a software person. I've known how to program since the 1970s, but I program for sensors. I don't program for a lot of the things that you would see in kind of the infotech or the AI or whatever areas now that are really important. I mostly program in C++, and I work on sensors and interfacing, and I have people that work at those more specialized areas like machine learning and other kinds of device interface software. So my topic here is about the Internet of Things. So I think you all know what the Internet of Things are, right? This is kind of a jargon, but anything, we'll define it a little bit more formally. But also about telehealth. So with the pandemic, I think a lot of people understand a lot more about telehealth than maybe a few years ago. It's actually expanding into lots of different areas. So I'm going to spend some time, because this is an intro course, I'm an engineer, you guys are into infotech, you're probably interested in much more software than I would be able to discuss intelligently. So I want to do something a bit different. I'll try to define what is this intersection between information technology and telehealth. You'll see a lot of the same kind of things on the internet, but I'll give you my interpretation, right? So every speaker can give basically, best thing we can do as speakers is give you our interpretation, our expertise, or our viewpoints on that area. But there's a lot you can find on that on your own. So I'm going to diminish the main content. I'm not going to try to give you all these equations and a lot of theory or a lot of detail, primarily because if you're interested, we can go into it. But I didn't want to dominate, which I would normally do in a regular kind of course, that if I was teaching a course or if I was involved in a conference. And probably because we're in a very a wide group of audience, so it wouldn't be appropriate for me to go off into 20 minutes or 10 minutes on that specific topic. But I'll give you some philosophical things you can look at. And some interactive stuff as well. So I think the feedback from you all as to what you're thinking after giving you a little bit of content, I think is going to be hopefully more rewarding. So here's, as they used to say in the show that I grew up watching, I guess, as Monty Python's Flying Circus. Monty Python's Flying Circus, now for something completely different. So the purpose of this is to get you thinking differently. So let's see if anybody can identify what this is. So excuse my technical problems. I'm going to have a bit of technical problems, but maybe you can get what this movie's about. All right. Anybody have any clue or want to venture a clue as to what this is, what this movie is about? Just very short clip.
What?
Yes.
Some sort of hunting when he's like following an animal.
All right, great. That's a good start. It could be. It could be. I'm not saying that I know exactly what was happening here, but it could be. Any other ideas? All right. Let's try to warm up the audience here a little bit. So, what is language? Can anybody define language? Yes.
Well, it's a series of sounds that we use to communicate meaning. If you're talking about verbal language, and if you're talking about written language, then it's a series of symbols we use to communicate meaning.
Right.
And the only reason it has meaning is because we all agree that it has some symbolic meaning to us.
Right. So we can have only we can have language that's only spoken. We can have computer language, right? That's basically, for all intents and purposes, only written or interpreted. But does anyone know how many languages there are in the world that are only by whistling? Anybody want to take a guess? How many languages in the world are only whistling? What's that? Well, I guess 1 million, 100, 5.
150. 40.
Yeah, it's close. 70 languages around the world are whistling. So this is known as the whistling language of the Canary Islands. Everybody know where the Canary Islands is? Anybody been to the Canary Islands? No? Okay. Off the west coast of Africa, off the coast of Morocco. This is Single Gomero. So my maternal grandparents are from the Canary Islands. So I got interested in this and I watched a documentary a few years ago about it. This is Spanish. What you're listening to is Spanish, translated into the whistling language of the Guanches, which is the original people that settled the archipelago of the Canary Islands in the island known as Gomero. So they adapted it in the 15th century to Spanish when the Spanish came in, as they always did. And the colonies kind of took over. So, Single Gomero. So, I think this is relevant for those of you who are thinking, continuing on, there's going to be a capstone at some point. It would be kind of curious if you guys would do a capstone project trying to do an AI to use something like one of these whistling languages. That would actually be pretty cool. Single Gomero has 2 whistles to represent 5 vowels, and it has 4 whistles to represent 22 consonants. And the way that they distinguish between what the letters are to make up the word is by changing the length of the whistle. So that's the basis of it. So and some of you who may know Spanish or are studying it currently, Spanish is pretty close to the same alphabet as English. There is a difference. There are more letters, but there are actually fewer letters now, I found out. So there's 3 or 4 letters. There are 2 letters that were removed from standard Spanish about 2010, which I was surprised at. But anyway, so think about that. And this is relevant to the presentation, even though it's a little bit off. The other one is maybe, okay. So the other one is more, I guess, again, back to my background growing up. It's in 1966. I turned on the TV to watch this show called Star Trek. And now there's a series, I think, on Amazon Prime. It's on the 2nd season. Some variation of this. I tried watching it, but I couldn't get into it. It's Captain Pike or something like that. So, how many watched the original series of Star Trek? Streaming. Somebody had. All right, Star Trek. Anybody watch any Star Trek at all? All right. So you don't have to watch this original series. All right, so this is actually the 4th episode. So kind of funny if you look back at some of the television, the way television was done back in the day. So you had to sell it with pilots. And so actually, the 4th episode film was actually the first episode run for the first time. And it shows you this. So what this is, you'll see it a little bit here in this clip. I didn't want to do any copyright for it. So I only got a very short clip from the TV speaking.
42 are pressure practice. So Paul that brings something remains blood.
All right, so this wouldn't fly with today's confidentiality laws, I guess, but this is a bed that in the Starship Enterprise where it would be vertical and the person would walk to the bed and just kind of lie back. It was one of those like gravity chairs. And as soon as you got horizontal, it would give you all of these vital sign. So the first time this aired in 1966, the first episode, the producers got a whole bunch of phone calls from hospitals and research centers around the United States saying, how did you know we were working on this? This is 1966. So 40, how old am I now? 40, I don't know, a long time later, almost 50 years later, I guess, or probably 50 years later now. We're still trying to make this, but we're getting close. So that's what the rest of this talk will be mostly about. And so you can go into the details. Those of you interested, you can kind of read it. Temperature, brain function, lung function, cell rate, blood, and there's a pulse reading and things like that. So it's a little bit too science fiction. We're not there yet, but we have some of these capabilities. So that's the end of my audio part here. So I'm going to come back after this little diversion to get you thinking about two things. One is, what is language? How do we interpret? How do we communicate? And the body has its own language. We have instruments that you see, you're all familiar with: stethoscope, pulse oximeters, pulse rates. And then we get into much more complex things for blood analysis, for imaging, in biomedical engineering, as well as in medicine in general. But so that is the type of area that I'm going to be talking about in relationship with telehealth, which is what can we learn using kind of a remote system that will give us an indication of the patient's wellness or any kind of condition the patient might have. So telehealth is rapidly accelerating. Some other countries have been accelerating telehealth a little bit more. You see commercials on TV now pretty regularly, or on YouTube, which is where I mostly watch stuff anyway, like most of you watch streaming channels or kind of videos from different providers. 60% of customers are now interested and would prefer digital services. So that's one of the reasons for driving telehealth. And then another thing about this is the pandemic caused an abrupt shift and that created a lot of the testing that would be done and a lot of the logistics as to how you would do this and why would people want to use telehealth, which mostly was video conferencing or calling versus having to go to a regular appointment. There have been several companies that have been existent before and are currently now available that are providing different kinds of devices so that care companies can come and monitor, especially in elderly patients or different conditions where somebody doesn't have the mobility or even special care, intensive living communities, things like that, assistive care. They have those kinds of monitoring apps, and some people have those at home as well, so they can transmit to the doctor. And then really the idea behind the technology development is because there's a market. Technology development and medicine development, new medicines, new procedures, new treatments, really expensive. Because you don't want to go and develop something that you haven't tested in lots of people and perfected for obvious reasons. So it's a big market, so that is driving finally interest in pursuing this. Now the Internet of Things, it's pretty simple. I think you guys all know about this. So let me just state the obvious, right? That it's really any device that interacts, I would call it, in the physical world and communicates it independently and autonomously over a network. So it doesn't have to be necessarily the regular kind of Internet of Things that you would see. It could be networked in some other way. But from the area of medicine, the question is, what are these devices? What could they possibly, how could they be useful? All right, so this is where it gets to the heart of what I'm going to be talking about. I'll talk about the company that I'm working with, and I'll talk more about what's called wearable devices, and that are also really could be considered stationary devices, right? So fitness trackers, how many people have a fitness tracker on right now? All right, got a couple people. All right, so all of you probably know that. You probably also heard that the Apple Watch got into some trouble. And so I'm not sure the status of it. I think they were They had some patent infringement issues, so I don't know if that's out. So maybe some of you are not getting these kinds of things. But if you have a Fitbit or some of these other providers, and there's lots of those available, both in fitness and then smartwatch. So they're kind of a blend of the two. There's also electrocardiogram monitors that can be wearable. There are a lot of people, if those of you who are on LinkedIn, which I'd recommend all students who are in technology or engineering majors or any science major, you should get on LinkedIn because you see a lot of companies and a lot of researchers and a lot of people in the business world talking about all of the latest areas. So this is a big area now, wearable monitors that they can, from a hospital, you can put it on a patient, send the patient home or to some other area while still keeping track of some of the vital signs. And then pulse oximeters, I think a lot of you have already learned about what this is. I'll get back to this. And then diabetes affects 10% of the population, growing in the United States and around the world. It's a growing problem. So glucose monitoring has now become, but for the last 6-7 years, has become a continuous glucose monitoring patch. Some of you may know people, or you may yourself have one of these glucose monitors. And then neurological monitors are starting to get a lot of interplay. You know, Elon Musk, anytime Elon Musk does something, it makes worldwide news. So they are planning on doing all kinds of things in this area as well. So this could be on the wearable side. When you actually have an implant, cardiac pacemaker, my sister-in-law has a pacemaker put in, that is always transmitting data. So again, that's a clear example. Medtronic is a local company here, also up north, but it has a main area of technology development in Tempe. They own that, and they've been doing this technology for quite a long period of time. Neurostimulators are another area that I mentioned that's going to be for treating certain types of conditions in patients. Cochlear implants is another area, so that's for hearing, right? To improve hearing or to make somebody be able to hear that they can't hear without it. And implantable drug delivery devices, another innovation that has been around for a long time, but it's being accelerated by all the developments that drive all of our technology. And then there's this area where, as I mentioned from the Star Trek idea, smart beds. So we're still far away from that Star Trek example I gave you from 1966 sci-fi, but it's getting closer and closer in a number of areas for monitoring, and especially with the area of sleep. Sleep seems to be a real big issue, big market, and on Amazon you see a whole bunch of things about monitoring your sleep besides the wearables, so the bed could become one of those areas. Automated drug dispensers, this is a big area for a number of reasons, primarily for the opiate problem, as well as for just to remind people to take certain medications. So there are companies that manufacture that. And then these home EKG, this is for a lot more intense kind of monitoring. And again, oximeters come in many different flavors. They come, the ones in a hospital are much more sophisticated than the one you can buy at Walgreens, for example, or any of the other pharmaceutical stores, or any stores. And smart scales. So how many people have gone to a gym or physical area where you've done your fitness test, where you've done that body fat and all that stuff, right? So these scales that you weigh yourself now are becoming much more intelligent. Now you can get what percentage is body fat, what percentage is water, and they give you some other kinds of things. So it's growing. I think some of you may be interested or will get involved somewhere in this area. So what I'm working on with a company that's based in Mexico City, has investment from New York and Texas at different stages, and have an expanded group of people doing the technology side. So the University of Edinburgh is working on the software side. I'm working more on the science side, developing with a group in Northern Europe who are developing the sensors and integrating everything. and the software is being developed by people in another country. So it's a global kind of effort, as most of these things have become these days, which is how do you put together a technology team without having to worry about building a building or hiring people. You look at people that are already in this technology space, and you can do that in a very efficient way. So those of you, some of you may have questions about that, so I'll leave them for later. I won't go into the details. This is actually a very simple looking device. It's designed to be small, designed at this level to be at a doctor's office, where you can put your finger inside there, and you can barely see it, there's an area for that, and it uses light in a number of different ways to measure several different physiological parameters. So it's using the latest optical technology. And you may not know about this, and again, this is something that surprised us the last couple of years, but there are some real new innovations in miniaturized lasers that are becoming very relevant for this kind of technology, which you'll see implemented in lots of different things. And there's also obviously a lot of explosion of machine learning and cloud computing associated with all of these kinds of devices. So we're in the middle of working on taking advantage of all of those developments. So what does it do? All right, so the first word, I guess, that might be new to you is, it's a big word, we're just gonna call it PPG, which is known as photoplethysmography. All right, so those of you know what a pulse oximeter looks like, right? You put it on your finger. I'm just gonna do this for the camera here. So it should be showing up sooner or later. So I'll give you my vital signs, like McCoy talked about Spock having green blood and having no blood pressure, but I think I have some blood pressure here. Okay, so I have oxygenation of 97 and a pulse rate of 68, all right, beats per minute. And then if I click a few things on this, I don't know if you guys can see it, but I can pass it around if you're interested. Let's see if I can get this to work. Oh, there it is. There's a waveform that comes out of it. So there's a bottom, there's a little waveform. So we'll pass it around here as I show and tell. So if you're not interested, just pass it over. Click the button in the middle. That waveform has a lot of information in it. So think about the whistling language, right? That is the body telling us something just by measuring what's going on in this change in the optical signal. So how does it work? You shine light. In this case, this is one type of photoplethysmography. You're shining light through the finger. So when you put your finger in, it recognizes that there's a light that's being blocked. It recognizes that the hinge is open. And then as you put your finger in there, you have infrared and red lights, usually, in those kinds of devices. The amount of light that can go through your hand, right, and your finger is depending on a lot of different things. So, I guess I put my phone away. But this is my easiest explanation of this. I did this as a little kid. I think everybody has done this as a kid. I do this with my granddaughter, just to show her, right? Which is, right, white light, and the stuff that goes through is red. That's the easiest explanation. Blue and green can't pass through, so you can't really use blue or green. There's too much scattering by the tissue, but red is okay. Red has less signal density for a number of reasons. But it's not that bad. And when it comes to oxygenation, it's pretty good just because of the nature of hemoglobin. I won't get into all the science behind it. If you have a question about it, we can. The next thing that we're doing is different from photoplethysmography. And just to say that these watches that do pulses, and even they do blood pressure as well, I could show them in the camera. But see, I'm walking around, so my pulse is now 88. I've been walking around a little bit too much, maybe. right? Is that, you can see that? And then I can do blood pressure, but it takes a while, right? And I'm probably messing it up because I'm tilting it. So comes around 117/71. And I'll do oxygenation. So this watch you can buy on Amazon for $18. But how accurate is it? So that's one of the things we can talk more about. So there's two types of photoplethysmography. That one goes through the finger. This one is reflected. So this one can have a green light. And so it uses green light for the pulse and for the waveform as well. I think it uses both green and red sometimes, depending on the type of watch. That's because of the way the light bounces off of the tissue on the back on your wrist, and that's why it can be used. Spectroscopy is something that is not in any of these devices. That's what we're adding to it. Without getting into a lot of the details, this spectroscopy is being used in some smartwatches coming out of Shenzhen in China to measure glucose. We're interested in measuring glucose with spectroscopy. There are lots of issues with measuring glucose in spectroscopy. Some of you who are interested can talk to biomedical engineering professors here. They can tell you all the problems trying to measure glucose non-invasively. But anyway, you can also use spectroscopy by looking at the infrared versus the red to measure blood oxygen. And that's can be done at the pulse oxygenation, and it can be done at the watch. The watch is not as accurate, and I have reasons. I can show you all the data on why the watch falls apart doing that, but the pulse oximeter does a really reasonable job on that. And so in this spectrum, what we're doing is we're taking a lot of data that is not taken in these two devices, in the near infrared. And then lastly, the last thing we're doing with light, so these are three very different ways of using light, using slightly different technologies, miniaturized lasers, miniaturized light emitting diodes, and miniaturized spectrometers that we can all fit in that little box I showed you earlier. Optical rotation. So without getting into a lot of the chemistry, optical rotation is something that glucose does pretty efficiently, and even at small variations in blood glucose in the or glucose in your tissues, you can tell the difference between, let's say, a glucose reading of around 100 to a different glucose reading of 70 or glucose reading of 150. You can distinguish them with optical rotation. And for those of you who may not remember from chemistry, it's basically the property of the molecule that has a specific orientation to the way the atoms are arranged. And when light in the form of electromagnetic radiation hits, you can distinguish the characteristics of the molecule by using polarized filters, in our case. All right, so that's the basics of the technology. We're focusing on using light and focusing on using the latest, greatest, and getting a lot of information. So more detail, just to show you, because I don't think it's easy to see what the pulse oximeter does. But here is what you would normally call an EKG, right? And this would be a monitor, which monitors directly your heart. So the heart action is actually not as simple as just a beat. It has chambers, has valves, and there are electrical signals that have to occur in order for the muscles to contract and the valves to open as a response to that. Right? So basically, you can this waveform would be what the EKG would be, but this waveform can be interpreted again, just like language, like the Spanish language versus that whistle that we heard for a few seconds. This is kind of the response that comes all the way up the finger for that complex thing, because we have pulsatile flow in our bodies, and that means that things move sporadically and the vessels expand and contract, and that creates blood pressure. So you can measure that by using a cuff and clamping down on that main artery until you loosen the pressure, and you can hear the rush of the blood going through that artery. That becomes this systolic pressure. And then as you lose the ability to listen to it on a stethoscope, is the diastolic pressure. So that pulsing movement is measured both in the blood pressure cuff, and then it translates itself as well in the photoplethysmography. Actually, there's a lot of debate about what that waveform really corresponds to exactly, but it is correlated. And there's reasons to believe most of it has to do with the way that blood vessels expand and contract in the pulsatile moment. But as without getting into a lot of details, anything that you measure in the body is not a direct measurement, especially if it's non-invasive. So there are all these complications that make it challenging. So this is what the data kind of looks like, just to give you an idea. You can take you can have a higher frequency data collection, you can make these really weird waveforms, and then that's where the machine learning comes in. So our approach is to take about 12 million data points for 10 seconds, which is actually possible using this platform, and then deconvolve all the information to translate it into pulse, oxygenation, blood pressure, respiration rate, glucose with a separate system, the spectroscopy and the optical precision system. Very challenging. So that's why it requires several $1 million of investment. That's why it requires years, and that's why nobody has this kind of technology yet. It's the goal is to be good enough to be able to screen people and a wellness check. That's the goal. It's hard to do wearables right now without tricorders. We don't have Dr. McCoy. We don't have Star Trek technology yet that we can get that exact without getting into the body or being more invasive to try to figure out what's going on in the body. So the data development strategies, I mentioned this here again. So in a nutshell, I'll just kind of breeze through it. As I explained, the whole goal of what we're trying to do is do most of our experiments using a platform. So I've been involved in developing a platform that will make sure that these wearables that we're prototyping this year, and then we're coming out with the first generation of them next year. We're going to have 200 prototypes. We're going to be doing large clinical trials, and we have to have a way of kind of calibrating them. So I've been developing a calibration system for that. And then farm out the data, stream out the data for the people in Edinburgh and the people in, can't remember where the other group is, in South America that are going to help with the software development. So it's a very distributed group of people that are involved in this project, in this company. All right, so that's my presentation in a nutshell. I didn't want to go through too much stuff. Again, went over a little bit my 20-minute goal. So I'm going to turn it over to you, primarily because I know I get to a point where I can go into a lot more detail. So any and all ideas, software, hardware, that you'd want to share and make a point about to help us with our discussion here about telehealth and or Internet of Things, and or anything else you might think is important in terms of development and technology in this area. Leave it up to the audience here. Yes?
What's your guys' main focus? What is your main focus to help?
Okay, the question is, what's our main focus in this company, ViiT Health? Our main focus is driven by the fact that wellness is not something that is easily accommodated in the US health system, and in systems like the UK and in Mexico, for example. There are other countries that are probably better examples. Medicine is socialized. So there's an incentive to treat the most people possible, get them as best care possible, but do it at a low cost. And it's subsidized at the government level by the people, the revenue of the government. So our goal is to come up with a device that can do screenings and can integrate into both of those worlds. So in the world of the US, it would be mostly for wellness. So people are thinking more and more about, when I go to the doctor, it's because I have a problem. So why can't we turn this around? Right? So When I go to the grocery store, why can't I take out my credit card and instead of tapping it or inserting it, why not, if I have to hold it, and as I'm holding it, it's reading, let's say, my vital signs and sending it through the Internet of Things. Now that's a little bit radical for the US, I don't know if that's ever going to come out. But maybe I just go to the gym or I go to the rec center. Maybe, one activity that I do. The other part of this is companies that are working, that have major manufacturing facilities, like Mexico again. There's been expressed a lot of interest to try to keep their workers healthy rather than having to deal with treatment. So our focus is more on wellness. We're not trying to diagnose things. And because the technology is not there yet to really be able to make medical claims. That's another reason. But that's a good point. Anybody still have the pulse oximeter? Anybody still alive? No, pulse, okay. Were you surprised by your pulse reading? Anybody take a pulse reading? No. You're still awake. All right, so what are the things you think would be important? Thank you. Would be important for in this area? Anything you think? Yes?
Well, with the sensing, using sensors to look at such sensitive data, lots of individuals, how does protection and security of that data would be very important. How are you implementing security measures to make sure there's no malicious users on the network trying to access the user's data?
It's a good point. Some countries, that information is private. Other countries, it's not, actually. But from this case, the software will be designed to be directed using the latest kind of encryption and the standards set by protection of individual personal data. So as the data is streaming, we're enrolling patients in a trial, explaining to them what we're doing. So whenever you enroll people in a trial like this, you have to tell them what you're trying to do, why you're trying to do it, what is the public good, what's their personal benefit from it, and then they have to accept it. So in that case, and then we have to make sure that we have the safeguards of the data. So the data has to be safeguarded in that case. Now to bring this out in the open, it's a good point what you bring out, which is in the US, that's going to be an issue if you're trying to transmit the data centrally. If you're trying to transmit it to only, let's say, the person and the doctor, then you have to design the software that'll encrypt that and will follow all those standards. So there are standards to go through with that. Other countries don't have those protections. They have some protections, but not necessarily all. So yeah.
So you're talking to mainly, I think, first year and second year students that probably have no idea what you want to be when you grow up. You know you want to be in technology, but you don't know what field. How did you map from where you went to school to where you are now? How many different career changes? How did you learn what you did? Tell us a little story about how you got where you are.
All right. So yeah, it's kind of a strange story, I guess, to some extent, but it's really an American story. I came to the United States as a refugee from Cuba. I was born right when all the fighting started. And so we left when I was about 3 years old and grew up in New York City. And so I wasn't sure what to be. I just knew that as an immigrant, I needed to make money. So I liked all kinds of science, and the space program was just getting started. Science fiction was becoming a big thing on TV. And so I thought I wanted to be a chemist or an archaeologist. So I realized archaeology, there's not much money to be made in archaeology, so I decided chemistry was pretty cool. And my parents my mom wanted me to be a doctor, but I realized that medicine wasn't something I was interested in. And my brain doesn't work that way. I didn't want to memorize like 1,000 muscles in the body, whatever that is. So I was more of an inventing kind of person, and I would read a lot. So I was good at reading and coming up to speed. So I started gearing towards chemical engineering growing up in New Jersey. So I thought, okay, chemistry, I really like chemistry. I like cooking. It would help my mom cook all kinds of things. I thought chemistry was pretty cool. And engineering seemed like a pretty lucrative field, so as a start. But as I got into chemical engineering, I realized I wanted to be a researcher. And so to do that, you have to get a Ph.D. So I started to ask the people at the company. I asked people, where should I go get a Ph.D.? And I decided to apply to a few places, a few local schools in New Jersey, and then I applied to the UC Berkeley. And UC Berkeley accepted me, and I thought, I told that to all the people who had PhDs in the company. I said, look, I got this offer, Carnegie Mellon, RPI at the time, and the Stevens Institute of Technology, and UC Berkeley. They said, you should go to UC Berkeley. College of Chemistry, Nobel laureates there. And so there is where I got really interested in the interface between chemistry and medicine at the molecular level. So I started off doing research in the biotech area, but when I became a professor at ASU, I was mostly doing physics of biological molecules using scanning probe microscopy. So much more interested in what does a molecule look like, which is a cool thing in the late 1980s, early 1990s, nobody really knew what molecules could look like under this microscope. And then what's all this technology and how does this all work? What is quantum tunneling? And how do you raster scan and how do you store all this information and make maps? So that's why I got interested in biomedical devices. So I became professor of biomedical engineering. Now fast forward, because this can get to be a really long, involved story, I was also interested in helping students, and so I had a large projects with the National Science Foundation, primarily to increase the number of students in science, math, and engineering, not just from all groups, but to try to target students that weren't represented at the time, and in numbers that we see nowadays with all of the universities have been really improving in these numbers. So we decided to come up with a series of programs, and then I directed these programs. And they were unusual because I got to work with lots of professors. I lost count of how many professors, literally thousands, which normally you don't do in your field, right? If you become a PhD, you usually work with in your field, and if you go to a research university, you do research in that area, you know your people in your sphere. So I got to see almost people from very many different areas, and that's how I got involved in Latin America. And so I got to do things in Latin America, which is kind of cool, primarily because my Spanish was not as good as I wanted it to be, but it was good enough to give a presentation to the First Lady in Panama about health back 20 years ago. And we formed a network of expatriates and were scientists, prominent scientists in Latin America, South America, as well as in the US. And that's the network that I still use to this day. Then I got involved with this company in Mexico because, when you look at Cuba as a basket case, it's been a basket case since 1959. And so there's no development there. Of all the countries in Latin America, Mexico has been the one that is the most developed and the most technologically driven. Some of them try, and some of them can do a really good job, and Brazil can do pretty well, but they have all these political problems, perennial political problems. So that's where I got driven to work there, and the people I work with have already developed technology and sold technology, so they're very well organized that way. So, you don't know where life's going to lead you. You have no idea the twists and turns. And this is the part where I was a musician for a while. I wasn't that great, but I got to do something. I got to play for money for a while. So I can still play music with my grandkids and stuff, if my hands let me do it. Long story. So don't worry, I would say I have the next step of my talk, which maybe I can anticipate, and we can go back to this. So, all right, so how many people watch YouTube? All right. So here are the people that I watch on YouTube. And maybe you all watch these people. I'll start with maybe one of the bigger ones. Do you know who James Orville is? I know it's nerdy kind of YouTube, but it's not the Stiver's name or anything, whatever her name is. She's the one that's real big, I guess. There are like 3 humongous people on YouTube. But these people are down the list. So James Orville does Action Labs. Did anyone watch Action Labs during the pandemic, maybe? Action Labs. James Orville. He took one of our videos that we published a few years ago, and he recreated it in one of his things. But Action Lab is pretty cool. He's a chemical engineer out of Utah, and he does demonstrations. He'll explain anything in science. So he has hundreds of videos. Steve Mould. Anybody know Steve Mould? Similar guy from the UK, right? So those 2 people are pretty interesting. Another one, maybe you've heard of her, Jade Tan Holmes from Australia. She's a math person, right? And Sabine Hassenfelder. Those are the 4 people I watch mostly. And then I watch some of the conspiracy theory stuff and Joe Rogan and all this stuff just for fun, right? So I'm not going to tell you, I just watch all the stuff. And I watch some news on YouTube. So read and watch widely. That's what my recommendation is. You never know what's going to strike your interest. Especially, you're in an area now in information technology, as you think about maybe having a career somewhat related to this area, or maybe in IT. It's really going to dominate the future moving forward for the foreseeable future, right? Read a lot, but also watch a lot. And, the other platforms are fine. I don't know much about the other streaming platforms. The other part I think is important is to think creatively. So how many people have time to daydream for 10, 20 minutes a day? You guys take that time. Take that time. We had that luxury before 2006, or whenever the iPhone was introduced. Take some time to daydream. Does anyone even know how to daydream anymore? So daydream is literally, sitting quietly and just letting your brain kind of go in any direction that it wants to go without trying to do something. It's a really important part that you start thinking about new ideas that I mentioned earlier. And ask questions. So I'll leave this up to you to ask any questions. And then develop a global network. Try to do something that you'll find a connection to a connection to a connection, right? And then find what are people like in Australia? What are people like in Estonia? Northern, like I said, Poland and those areas, Hungary, they do a lot of technology there. You just never hear about it here, but they really have developed some cutting edge things in areas. And what do the software engineers in Uruguay do? What do the people in Shenzhen, what are they working on? Some of these huge manufacturing facilities in South Korea. So we got the capability with the phone, but we also have the capability with networks, but we also have the ability to travel. So any chance you get to travel, especially students, you get to go to a conference in Washington, D.C., and the rest of the world comes to you. Or in Phoenix, Arizona, the rest of the world comes to us in a conference. And then find your passion and run with it. It's always hard to find that. So what is it you really like to do? You really like to work with people. Information technology is great for that. If you really want to do software, there are lots of companies that do that, but there's also environments to do that, very different environments. And what is it about that you want to be able to do? You want to be able to have a job where you can work for 2 or 3 years and then take off and sail around the world for a year. Those are your passions. I think you should think about that and see how you can structure your career to do that. And so I know people that do that kind of stuff, and especially more popular these days. And I was trained to just work, and then I never retired. So that's my thing. Any more questions? I didn't want to go without some interaction. Questions? Any kind of questions? Yes?
I have one, just to go back to technology for a second. Everything I've seen that you're looking at in terms of technology with the IoT and stuff focuses in on light. Why not sound, pressure, either as maybe a corollary add-on or as an alternative and some of that, just maybe 60 seconds or something like that, because one of the things we do like to push here is undergraduate research.
Right.
And if somebody were to find something that could add on or add more data to this thing, would we maybe find these biobeds thing that is more rapidly approaching us?
Yeah, that's a good point. I only focus on what we're focusing on with this one product, but that's the goal, is to, if you can't, any company that starts off trying to develop a product, we have to get like laser focused on it. So that's our laser focus. But once it's out there, the idea would be to keep adding to it. So there is a company in Las Cruces, Mexico, that does develop a suite of different devices for home care, and they've actually developed some AI systems for assisted living. So, and sound is becoming a really important area that you can design things to listen, especially for the sensitive listening. If somebody has a wheezing sound, especially in the voice, what kind of trembling sound. Then there's balance monitors, so you can adapt your phone. A good friend of mine has been successful with software that can detect how well people walk, and they have training systems for people like FedEx and UPS workers to make sure that they know how to fall correctly when they're carrying a package. So these kinds of tracking of body movements is another area that is going to be important as you get older, or even if you're not getting older. It's just that if you have a nagging injury, you may not realize that you are setting yourself up for either more injury or for some other problem. There's a lot of interest as well in electrical systems to measure, like I said, body fat and hydration. People are trying to measure sweat a lot, and I'm not that interested in that, and I don't think that's really that easy to do, because anything your body's trying to get rid of is a hard thing to use as a way to probe what the body's doing. It's very difficult from a chemical perspective. Whereas things that the body needs, that is a lot easier to go directly to measuring that. Then the eye is another window to health. So there's a lot of stuff people have been trying to develop around the eye or eyesight area, and also because of the interesting characteristics. But Gatorade, I know, has some sweat technology that they're trying to develop to measure hydration, things of that nature. So there's a lot of activity, and the electrical signals, like I said, the wearable EKG, and for body fat, these kind of giant resistance measurements, high impedance measurements to measure that body composition.
Thank you, Dr. Garcia.
All right.